going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power, your host, coming to you from a very hot day in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the middle of the summer. Now what we're doing here is just going back over the How We Got Here series, but just the music. It's the music edition. This is part 2 of 3. This just covers the 1980s. And it's the longest one. And actually I did 3 different episodes on the 1980s, not because I'm enamored of the 1980s. I have absolutely no nostalgia for the 80s. I lived through the 1980s very consciously. They were a slum of a decade with a lot of garish neon colors. And I much preferred the 90s. Looking back, I preferred the 70s. I remember the 60s. I even prefer the last 10 chaotic years to the 1980s. And not musically, I think the last 10 years have been abysmal musically, but the 1980s was a time when so much of the template for where we would end up would be born. I'm not going to go over all of the things I went over in the actual series. We're just doing the music. And for the music today, we're kind of divided in 2 parts. The first part is the illusions, the nostalgia, which it is my fervent hope to destroy from the 1980s, because most of what people remember from the 1980s didn't actually happen. That is to say, if you look back at the 1980s and your mind immediately starts filling with Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Breakfast Club and Michael Jackson, well, you know what? Those things are just videos. They're just movies. They didn't happen. That wasn't what the reality of the 1980s was about. But today we feed on this. And my feeling is that the second part, Underground in the 80s, is much closer to the truth of the 80s. And you need to pick that up and you need to get that into your system so that you no longer have any nostalgia for the 1980s. So, shall we go and continue with our music edition, part 2, How We Got Here. You know you want it. Now, if you were here for How We Got Here number 5, where I talked about the rise of punk rock at the end of the 1970s, you would think that punk rock and new wave were going to be the trends that dominated the popular landscape of the 1980s. And in a way, you're right, but mostly you're wrong, especially with punk rock. Punk rock, well, Joan Jett, for instance, here she is, doing a piece, doing Bad Reputation, one of her classic pieces. This is from 1980. And she is essentially just doing punk rock. She would later become famous for just doing regular rock music, hard rock, we'll call it.
I don't give a damn about my reputation. You're living in the past as a new generation. And a girl can do what she wants to do, and that's what I'm gonna do. And I don't give a damn about my bad reputation.
Punk and new wave essentially had to be watered down. Punk, by the time the Clash were finished, they totally just turned punk into a commercial artifact. But also, there were bands who had kind of started off doing something like punk or new wave music, who were, well, some of them mutated into what we call the new romantics. Some of them ended up being just perfect fare for the beast, which will come soon, called MTV. But other bands, like the following, here's Wall of Voodoo, singing their pretty great song, Mexican Radio, but watch how they're singing it.
I hear the talking of the DJ. Can't understand just what does he say. I'm on a Mexican radio. I'm on a Mexican radio.
And since we're watching Wall of Voodoo, let's watch They Might Be Giants. Each of these guys is from opposite sides of the coast. But notice, again, how they are singing and performing.
They want what they're not, and I wish they would stop saying dibby dog dog ding dang dibby 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 dog dog ding dang dibby dibby dee. World destruction over an overture. And do I need a positivity? Need this dot shot? Don't let's start. This is the worst part. To believe for all the world that you are my precious little girl, but don't let's start. I've got a weak heart and I don't get around. How you get around?
What do you see? What you see is an extraordinarily ironic take. In neither of these can the musicians be said to performing in a sincere manner. Are they being comedians? No. They're being funny, yes, but they're not trying to be comedians. They're doing something very different than standard comedy. They're not saying, I'm doing this to make you laugh. What they're saying is, ain't it ironic? And if you're watching, you're in on the joke. And what you're really watching here is the first kinds of signs of a new culture. And it's the culture that would come to dominate everything. It is the rise of a very ironic, knowing, cultural quoting, postmodern aesthetic. It's the rise of geek culture. It's the rise of cute culture. That is to say, there were geeky things and cute things before these songs, but there weren't the kinds of people to appreciate them. I often think about this when I overhear people having conversations, and in those conversations, it's the tone of the conversation. And I say to myself, do these people realize that no one, say before the 1980s, ever spoke in these kind of jokey, knowing tones that are just interlarded with cultural quotes and such? It's in the 1980s that you get people who get into watching Gilligan's Island again. Why do they do that? Because they have videotapes that they can go back. But, it's like, I Love Lucy. You have these cultural touchstones. Now, the people in the 80s are going back to the 1950s and to the 1960s. And they're looking at these things and they're quoting. By the end of the 1980s, people would be talking, knowingly about the Brady Bunch. If you haven't seen these television shows, don't worry about it. I mean, they're just cultural detritus. But it's the way people would talk about these things that would form the new aesthetic, the postmodern aesthetic. And again, I'm using this in cultural terms. I'm not trying to argue with Derrida or Lacan or any of these people at this point. I'm just simply saying, say what you want, this is postmodern culture. And it is vastly different than the culture of the 70s or the culture of the 60s or anything that came before it. However, we've been frozen in this kind of aesthetic ever since. And we're seeing it break now in different ways. One is towards fanaticism. That breaks postmodern, because then many of those people the people who were laughing at things then wouldn't be laughing in the same way now. But that's where we're going. Oh yeah, let's talk about MTV.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Last night a DJ saved my life. Last night a DJ saved my life, yeah.
You see, there's not a problem that I can't fix, 'cause I could do it in the mix. And if your man gives you trouble, you just move out on the double, and you don't let it trouble your brain. Said away goes troubles down the drain. Said away goes troubles down the drain.
Last night a DJ saved my life, yeah.
I want my MTV!
This is a journey into sound.
Last night a DJ saved my life.
I want my MTV.
I wish I was in Tijuana, eating barbecued iguana.
When I wake up, people take up mostly all of my time. I'm not singing, funky, ringing, 'cause I make up a rhyme.
It's hammer, go, hammer, empty hammer, yo, hammer, and the rest can go in play. Can't touch it. Sound of the funky drummer. Music hit your heart, 'cause I know you got a soul. Another summer. I want my MTV.
Life is a mystery. Everyone must stand on the
MTV changed everything. And not for the better. But it did do some good things. I don't have any problems with videos, rock videos, as a form. I do have a problem with the way music was starting to be consumed, though. And it went with other changes in the way films were being consumed as well, and the way culture in general was being consumed. How did MTV change music? The musicians now became familiar faces. There are stories of musicians like Tom Petty, who have been performing at the end of the 70s. No one really knew what he looked like. You'd go see him in a big auditorium or something, he'd be sitting over there. Maybe a few people would really pay attention. You could read about these people in music magazines, or like Rolling Stone, or the British had a lot of like Enemy and Melody Maker and these sorts of things. Cream magazine. But basically, you'd never seen these people that often. You were not exposed to them. If you wanted to really see them, you had to go to the concert. Now, these videos were putting their faces everywhere. And so Tom Petty tells a story of how he's walking down the street, and he says, somebody comes up to him and says, "Where's your hat? Where's your Mad Hatter's hat?" And he's looking at him, "Well, what are you talking about?" He'd done this video briefly where he put on a Mad Hatter's hat in one of his songs, and suddenly that caught on, and people are now walking up to him and saying, "Where's your hat?" Well, that's what happens. This familiarity with faces becomes now just absolutely multiplied. And we start looking at these people in very different ways. Music essentially becomes connected to visual packages. The biggest artists of the decade, Michael Jackson, Bruce Springsteen, Madonna, Prince, all had to package their music in certain ways. Some artists, like Madonna, sold herself as a package. That is to say, her music was secondary to the image, and she would, borrowing from David Bowie's unwritten rules of changing your persona, which harken back to Bob Dylan's changing of his persona, which harkens back to Frank Sinatra changing his persona more subtly, which harkens back to Harry Houdini going through 3 major career shifts during his lifetime. This sense of changing your identity became Madonna's sine qua non. That is to say, you couldn't imagine Madonna without her occasional shifts in image. That is who she was. And the music really was secondary. Now, she has some nice songs. I think there was a moment when she was honest. One moment. She got close to being very honest. And it was during the Like a Prayer album, which generated a certain amount of controversy for the images. But if you compare that album to all of her other albums, you'll find this is the closest you get to the real Madonna. After that and before that, they are illusions. But she goes back to her natural brunette hair. She hasn't yet had her face sculpted. She is just being herself, trying to deal with issues about her father, the breakup with her marriage with Sean Penn, these sorts of things. She is just being herself, to the degree she can. I often say Madonna could never sell out because she never bought in. No one ever thought she was a great artist, in the really genuine sense of art being meaningful production. This is as close as she got. Madonna, other artists like Cyndi Lauper, Pat Benatar, had a real effect on the style of the times. In a sense, it's this new wave style mixed with a bit of black, what we now call urban style. I like how these words keep getting changed over the years for what the music is. Sophisticated R&B. But And also there was this effect in the movies. There were several dance movies in the middle of the 1980s. There was Footloose, Staying Alive, which was a pretty bad sequel to Saturday Night Fever. And then, of course, there was Flashdance, which had a big effect, of course, on the way girls mostly looked. Take it away, Flashdance. Of course, Flashdance was a complete fantasy. She was, a welder by day, worked as an exotic dancer who never got nude by night, and was trying to become a ballerina. And of course, she takes inspiration from hip-hop dancing. Yeah. I can't even begin to tell you how stupid all that is. However, it had a big effect on, again, the mindset of the way people looked and acted. Again, filled now with cultural quotes. Now, one could say, it's always been cultural quotes. And yeah, you're right. But the point is now, they're coming at a much faster clip. And they're coming more ironically, which is why Madonna could later be said to be a deconstruction of Marilyn Monroe. And it's not that Madonna was trying to be Marilyn Monroe. She wasn't trying to be a Marilyn Monroe type character. She was a deconstruction of Marilyn Monroe. And I remember having these conversations with people at the time. It's just like, why are you using the phrase deconstruct? It doesn't mean anything. It means take apart. Why don't you just say destruct? But I understand what it means now. That is to say, it has a very specific kind of meaning. When you deconstruct something, you're not simply taking it apart. You're taking it apart to reassemble it in any manner you see fit, ironically. Which is why I always kind of react when people talk about deconstructing, we're going to deconstruct the church. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. It's already really bad. Don't try to put it and build it back up in some new image with new postmodern cultural quotations around it, But again, that's too much of an issue to talk about. One artist who should have had more exposure because she was very visual during the time, and yet didn't, was Kate Bush. She started off in the 1970s having a strangely ethereal voice, singing about the book Wuthering Heights.
You had a temper like my jealousy, too hard, too greedy. How could you leave me when I needed to possess you? I hated you, I loved you too. Bad dreams in the night.
Now, she tended to incorporate a lot of dance in her work because she was also a trained dancer and mime. But she started doing these really fascinating videos. I showed a little bit of one of her clips at the end of my MTV montage. But check out, this is the beginning of a piece called Army Dreamers. And just look at the way she's moving with the music. Now, I'm purposely not showing you a lot of those clips, and you should go look for them yourself. But the point is this. She did have one moderate hit in America, and that was Running Up the Hill. But the truth is, she never became that popular. She was much more popular in England. But I think it was because she was much more of an artist. And in fact, she is the first person, as a woman, to start doing these shows where she would have the mic little mic attachment come around, so she was free. She would incorporate dance elements. She would move with the music. Sometimes she would play the piano. Much as everyone, Madonna, Britney Spears, Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, have done these same kinds of multi-dimensional, multi-media performances since then. So she kind of set the template for that, but most people didn't really know that. But she's someone from this period who's really worth looking at. And I would say out of all the artists from the 1980s who were in what I would call the surface level, she was the one who was most really genuinely an artist and is worth going back to and paying attention to. There are others who are on the underground who are worth paying attention to as well, but we'll talk about them next week. And then this strange thing started in about, 83, 84. There was a group of people who got together in England and did this song, Do They Know It's Christmas? Which then led to We Are the World, which is probably number 2 in line for a globalist anthem after Imagine by John Lennon. Let's try to stomach a couple seconds of We Are the World. Joe Bob Briggs, the great drive-in movie critic, once did a really sarcastic take called We Are the Weird. He just wrote it all down, but he also made up lyrics for it. And this got him booted from, I think it was the Dallas Herald Tribune or whatever the name of the paper is. He's still sore about that to this day because they couldn't take the joke. Well, they wouldn't be the first people to not get the joke. And they wouldn't be the last, because essentially the people who would get squeamish and goody-goody about that sort of thing, for one thing, a lot of that money that was raised for that and for Live Aid never got anywhere near its intended victims. I mean, some of it did, but an awful lot got siphoned out to the people who work at NGOs. That is to say, it went to the people who are working with the people who were trying to help things.
When we stand together as one, we are the children.
And there were a huge amount of benefit concerts and benefit albums at this time. There was Live Aid, Farm Aid, what was the comedy one? Comic Relief, that's it. All of which were there to provide, it's like important performers playing to expose themselves more, literally, and to get the word out about donating to these charities, all of which were funded by people who were siphoning off money. You could never really get the money directly to the people. It was very difficult to do that. My favorite of all the performance and album benefits during this time was the Sun City project. I'm not going to play Sun City, which was in South Africa it was put together by Little Steven, Bruce Springsteen's good friend, who also plays with the E Street Band, Little Steven Van Zandt. And let me show you a clip of that. Now, the thing about all of these, We Are the World, Do They Know It's Christmas, Live Aid, Farm Aid, Comic Relief, and the Sun City Project, is that they are all essentially forms of propaganda. That is to say, I don't think they're genuine movements. They're things that someone comes up with and then goes out. You can argue with me about this, but I remember I bought the Sun City album, saw the video, and I thought, it was pretty cool. You've got all, out of all the performers in different albums and benefit concerts. These were the performers I thought were the coolest. So you had Bruce Springsteen, the Ramones, various rap acts, and it seems like Bob Dylan was always everywhere in one of these. And I'm a big Dylan fan. I'm going like, Bob, just don't worry about it. But I still felt it was propaganda. One of the things, and there was a lot of rising tide. This is where you first started to see this politically correct approach start to rise at the end of the 80s. You'd start to find students protesting their schools' investments in South Africa. Which I thought, okay, maybe there's something there. But what I didn't like was the attitude. And the attitude was, we are absolutely 100% right. Don't get in our way. And that attitude is what we are infested with now. And I remember thinking about that at the time. I'd already read Jacques Ellul's Propaganda. And I was starting to see, if we only communicate with propaganda, we shall lose real communication. We were already beginning to lose it seriously by that time. One day, I was in a movie theater on 42nd Street. I was watching the film La Bamba, the Richie Valens story. Pretty good film. And I noticed, it was like 12 o'clock opening day, 12 noon opening day. Hardly anyone was in the theater. In New York City, most people have to wait till a little bit later in the day to go to the movies. And I noticed in the theater was little Steven. So as I was leaving, I started up a conversation with him. We walked for about, 15 blocks or so. And I really liked his music at the time, although I'd noticed he'd taken a turn off into this, social justice area. Social justice. It was starting to become an issue. And I started talking to him about the Sun City Project, and I started talking to him about the concept of propaganda. He, of course, defended himself. And one of the things he said was, well, what do you expect? What other way is there to communicate? Well, whatever there is, you can't beat people over the head with we're right, you're wrong. There's other ways to communicate. And often I find that people set up these scenarios for various... they set up these scenarios for various projects and ideas and social justice goals. But they also make it that anyone who brings any sort of challenge to the idea is one of them. But he admitted it. He basically said, how else can you communicate? He admitted it was propaganda. But he also couldn't see another way out. And I realized, since I'm thinking about these things, I have to try to think of a way to communicate without being a propagandist. And one of it is to leave it as an open discussion and not a closed discussion. Anything I say is my opinion. It's based on research, but hey, I'm one person. I can get a lot of facts wrong, but I can also get my emphasis wrong. So I don't mind people who challenge me because maybe they'll help me to get things right. I don't think it's a coincidence that around this time you have people like Tracy Chapman emerging, who is singing about social justice issues. And in a sense, what she's doing, she's going back to the early folk protest era and bringing that kind of emphasis on changing the world, again, through music. She plays very simple, stripped-down music. And what does she sing about? Let's give a listen.
Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper.
Revolution's just a whisper when she's singing. Well, I dare say it's now gone from a shout to a full-fledged scream. And that's the problem again. It's the kind of, it's the kind of situation we see where it's the attitude. I mean, what's funny to me is she's singing about revolution. Like, it's just going to happen. We need a revolution. Things must change. And yet the kind of revolution she's actually talking about is, well, it's got to have bloodshed attached to it. And that's where the problem comes in, is this romanticization. Communism, Marxism has always had two strains. One, the romantic strain. We're going to change the world. And the other, the hard line, the cynical Communist Party member type, who basically says, okay, yeah, well, heads have to roll. So that brings us up to the subject of rap music. Rap music at this point, we discussed the rise of rap music in episode 5. Rap music now has graduated from block parties to becoming something that's much more of an art form, a music form. And you can see this with someone like Run DMC.
And that's the way it is. DMC bills rise higher every day. When it did we receive much lower pay.
Run DMC is the first band to really change the format up, to add layers and textures to it that it no longer had. They had been doing the actual, block party style. But then what happened was they ran into a record producer who basically said, well, why don't you mix it up with a bit of rock music? And that was kind of the beginning of this new thing. Eventually you would have Public Enemy, the Beastie Boys, many other bands. MTV at first was really hesitant to get on board with any black acts. Then CBS Records threatened to pull out their entire musical roster if they didn't take Michael Jackson. So they took Michael Jackson. And of course, Thriller made MTV. That album and the songs from it. Also Prince. But then by the end of the decade, rap music was all over the place. And you started having commercial forms of rap music. People like MC Hammer, Vanilla Ice. But then something else was starting to come. For instance, I first noticed it in I believe it was 1988 film, Colors. Let's watch this for a moment. Listen to the lyrics. It starts off, well, just listen.
I am a nightmare walking, psychopath talking, king of my jungle, just a gangster stalking, living life like a firecracker, quick as my fuse, vendettas a death, back the colors I choose, red or blue, cause of blood, it just don't matter, suckers die for your life when my shotgun scatters, the gangs of LA will never die, just multiply colors.
If you listen to the lyrics about being a nightmare and a psychopath and a gangster, this is a new aesthetic, which will become much more important in the 1990s. So this is the hearkening of a new period coming.
Somebody's got to say this isn't right, because everybody else is saying it's morning in America. Somebody's got to say it's fucking midnight, man.
Plug it in.
Underground in the 1980s. And this is the third 80s episode. And I guess a lot happened in the 80s. For me, the 90s were more important in many ways. But the 80s set the template for the 90s. And that's what we're going to talk about today, essentially. It seemed like 1 minute in the 80s, you had all these people with big hair and fluffy costumes and stuff. And then the next minute, it was all flannel shirts and Nirvana. Well, it wasn't like that at all, actually. What happened was something was underground that was bubbling up. And we're going to look at what was underground and was bubbling up. This is the 80s that doesn't get the nostalgia. A lot of people get nostalgic for all that superficial stuff we talked about last time. But this is the 80s that was bubbling under everything. Much, much, much darker. If we can say that the big hair and the big movies and even the political culture war brewing was all the zeitgeist of the time, this is what Virginia Wilson in her book, The Secret Life of Puppets, calls the sub-zeitgeist, what's actually underneath, which in many ways represents the real world. If you look at the post-World War II era, for instance, the zeitgeist was things like silly songs on the radio, big band, smooth, easy listening music and such. But what was underneath it was stuff like film noir and EC horror comics, which really gave you an idea of what the times are really like as far as the darker part. Also in this, we're going to see the rise of tribalism. And I'll define that more as we go along. But for me, it's important to understand. For instance, we often talk about tribalism now between left and right. Well, actually, there's lots more different kinds of tribalism than that going on right there. But this retribalization starts really and comes in the 80s in a way it hadn't before. And we're going to look at that. So, first thing we're going to do is look at hardcore punk. What is hardcore punk? It's predominantly, and first of all, an American phenomena. Punk rock came to America and inspired a few bands in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, although New York City's punk scene had started way before even the British punk scene. But there was this thing that was happening. Also, some of it turned into this other thing called New Wave. I've discussed these things already. But by about 1980, it was clear that the punk scene was not going to be the dominant scene in the popular landscape. And what you saw instead was the rise of MTV. Some of the aspects of the punk scene, like the New Romantics, which were, how they connect to the punk scene, they do, but they don't. They are already a betrayal, certainly, of the punk spirit, although they take certain aspects of it with them. But they groups like, Culture Club, Duran Duran, the Thompson Twins, these kind of groups had some sort of visual flair that worked on MTV. But the actual punk music, that fast, loud, tuneful kind of stuff, and angry, sometimes rageful music, didn't get too far as the mass markets go. A lot of people think the Clash were a great punk band. I don't. I look at the Clash as being kind of sellouts to the kind of woke politics we see today. And even then, I was completely unamused when I saw them performing live at Bonds on Times Square. And they had they had invited Grandmaster Flash to play before them, and people were throwing cups and stuff at them while they were rapping with these turntables, and the Clash just came out and played their normal set. And even though they were all in, they helped pick the acts and everything, they didn't defend the acts. And I heard the same thing happened with, I believe it was Peter Tosh, a reggae artist, one of the Bob Marley and the Wailers, the next night. In other words, they had these black acts come on before, but rather than defend them, they just played their set to the what we call the Bridge and Tunnel people, because they had a hit called Train in Vain, and they weren't really what they claimed to be, which is a trend. But that's the mainstream. What is hardcore? Well, you know what? Hardcore comes from the rage and the anger and the sense of desperation and the meaninglessness that had been left to American youth by the year 1980. And in fact, let me play you a bit of a documentary called American Hardcore. This was made in the year 2006. This is probably your best introduction to what hardcore punk was. So let's play that.
Been going through one of the worst periods in music possible. Disco was at its peak. Rock bands were still big, like Foghat. Just crap.
Everybody was into this, like, well, we've got a shiny brand new car, and I just got my hair feathered, and oh, look at my clothes, and oh, here, I want some cocaine, and we're drinking wine coolers, and just all that kind of crap.
For me, it was just so bored with what was going on. I mean, in 1980, we're still listening to the Doors and the Beatles, and we're supposed to be bowing down to that music, and it just wasn't our music.
They were all like formulaic bands, like Journey and the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. They're all great bands for what they do. It's just that when you hear it constantly over and over and over again, you're going to want to just vomit or jump off the nearest cliff. Throw yourself out in front of an oncoming bus.
As a boy, I'm coming up through the 60s, so I thought, my late teens, early 20s were going to be the most radical years of my life, and I get there, and it's, Pete Frampton in a kimono, man.
Time was slow back then. Things were barely moving, and this music just came along and it was like an electrical charge.
It was like a fucking comet hitting the planet. You know what I mean? It came out of left fucking field, dude. I had never heard nor seen anything like this.
The music that we were performing, the lyrics that we were writing had nothing to do with about holding hands and smiling and skipping off into the sunset.
I couldn't fucking resist this incredible scene being under my fucking doorstep, full of hatred for mainstream normalcy, just like I was. I mean, it was just like, fuck it, I'm diving in. I don't care if I ever come back up again. And it took a good long while.
We'd been made all these promises. You go to school, you do your homework, you go to college, you get a great job, you make lots of money, you get married, you have a couple of kids, dog, cat, goldfish, two-car garage, and that's just not the way that it is.
Somebody's got to say this isn't right, because everybody else is saying it's morning in America. Somebody's got to say it's fucking midnight, man.
I'm working Monday through Friday. Here comes Friday night, and I'm just going to go off. I hate my boss. I hate the people that I work with. I hate my parents. I hate all these authoritative figures. I hate politicians. I hate people in government. I hate the police. Everybody's kind of pointing the finger at me. Everybody's picking at me. Everybody's poking at me. And now I have a chance to be with a bunch of my own type of people, and I have a chance to go off. And that's basically what it was.
To me, punk was the portal. It was the portal to the counterculture. That's where I belong. That's where I live. That's how I got there. But punk rock at that time was becoming more associated with just the Sex Pistols and Sid Vicious. And Sid Vicious was, he was a junkie, nihilistic junkie, and we were not. So we really were trying to carve out our own place. So we said, no, we're hardcore punk. That's, hardcore punk.
We started calling it hardcore. Okay, like, like as far as being like hardcore porn. It means it's right down to the core. It's the real deal.
I could never be Gene Simmons or Ace Frehley or some band where where you're spitting out fire and there's explosions, and I couldn't play like Eddie Van Halen. I still can't. And there's this new sound comes along, and it's simple but aggressive.
I guess the whole new wave thing was going on, and it was just kind of sickening, to tell you the truth.
Then you started having, all these, all the, what they used to call skinny tie bands, all the day glow bands, because they were all wearing those neon colors.
When hardcore came out, I was a little kid, and I had missed out on, the 77 punk thing, and I wasn't around for the 70s rock thing. So here was something that was happening that was new, that we were making up as it went along. We were making the rules up and creating this sound, and the bands and the people around, when the scene was small enough, it was exciting. It was like you were on the cusp of something that was just, you didn't know where it was going to go.
Normal people did not listen to hardcore, and we liked it that way, right? Because you can listen to that shit. You can listen to Fleetwood Mac. Go listen to that shit. We are not going to abide it. We're about blowing all of that up. We're about destroying everything in that. And you can't live our way unless you cross that divide.
Did I mention that this was going to get intense? Yeah, hardcore. It's like this eruption. It's like a tuneless punk. It was just like chants. It was like anger. It was like, just like the mosh pit was a place where fists flew and there was beer on the ground and people were breaking bottles, and it was just chaos. But it was a chaos that I'm convinced was out of desperation, a philosophical desperation. And also, as America entered the 80s, Ronald Reagan was elected. One of the things that most hardcore punks hated was any sign of the Reagan government. And they tended to look at any sign of returning to any sort of normalcy, which included the hippie world as well, as being something they couldn't stand. Let's watch this clip.
In the early 80s, there was a sense of reestablishing the order. The white man, the Ronald Reagan white man order is coming back. You'd had that wimp Jimmy Carter talking about peace and human rights and all this other shit. And you'd had, the feminists and the Negroes and they're all getting uppity on us, right? So we're going to reinstitute order here, right? And so the whole country goes into this really puerile 50s fantasy where they're dressing in these cardigan sweaters, and we were just like, fuck you, not us. You can take that and shove it up your ass.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Punk rockers loved to hate Reagan worldwide. Songs were written, posters were made, signs were raised, and oranges were hurled.
Every punk rock band of that era must have had at least one or two posters where they'd have the picture of Ronald Reagan from the Killers with the gun like this, right? With that look on his face type thing, like, I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker.
You fucked up right. You're not gonna last. You're done that too. From the door. You fucked up right. You fucked up right. You fucked up right. You fucked up right.
Now, you might get the feeling from watching this documentary that there was a lot of political correctness among the punks. And you'd be wrong. That is to say that by today's standards, these were not politically correct people. One of the problems is, of course, this is being done in the year 2006. And whatever the people believed by 2006, they were reinterpreting their experiences in the past being that way. The truth is, were you to show up at any of these music concerts, yeah, there'd be kind of a leftist feel, but just as much an anarchist, we don't care feel as well. And so it wasn't about, these weren't the shock troops for the left. These were the chaotic youth who also felt betrayed by the left as well, although people on the left were trying to scoop them up. But consider this song by a group called the Angry Samoans, and it has got the simple title Homosexual. And ask yourself, this is a really short song, under a minute, which is typical of hardcore punk songs. They had to be super fast, super short. And ask yourself, what perspective does this fit into? Are these people, are they making fun of gay people? Are they supporting them? You know, all of our standards today. What does this have to do with it? And I think you'll find it slips out of all the categories and is something else. Give it a listen, if you can.
Screw your wife and get behind. Tell your kids you're doing fine. God, you're no good, stupid liar. Sucking dick, your pants on fire. Homosexual, up the ass. Homosexual, make it last. Homosexual, jerk me off. Homosexual, go get lost. Found out that your dad was gay, living life a brand new way. Last week you flew Howard News, 40 facts from the Jews. Homosexual, we love you. Homosexual, things you do. Homosexual, killed and white. Homosexual, was it right? Don't like boys, you like girls, living in your faggot world. Talking shop with lawyers' wives, sneaking out to meet the guys. Homosexual, I'm ashamed. Homosexual, that's your name. Homosexual, where's the blame? Homosexual, I can't explain. Homosexual, we love you. Homosexual, up the ass. Homosexual, Darby Crash. Homosexual, make it last.
See, I told you couldn't fit this into your categories. So, related to hardcore punk was a movement in England called Oi, O-I. And this was kind of a working class youth rebellion music. It eventually becomes what we call skinhead music. Here's a group called Screwdriver, and they're singing a song called I Don't Like You, which the title could have been any number of hardcore punk songs. But they eventually take their style into, well, neo-Nazi stuff. And out of this comes this kind of skinhead image that we all understand today. That is to say that it starts in England, but mutates into America as well.
Give up working, give up putting my head. All the people giving me all love, just making me red. There's a breaking out beat now, playing in the rock and roll band, playing that rock and roll music. Who's gonna get it? I don't like you. I don't like you. I don't like you anymore.
In 1992, there was an Australian film that kind of reflects back on the 80s skinhead movement, and it's called Romper Stomper. And while they had these studio musicians doing the kinds of music that the skinheads listened to, again, a form of hardcore punk, they didn't invite the actual hardcore punks to make the music. So this song is called Fourth Reich Fighting Man, and you get the implications there of the third. And but what's interesting about this is that later other skinheads would take this song and make it their own, or even use the recording of the song because it was so close to being exactly what they did. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about goth and industrial music, which are on one level related and on another level very different from each other. Let's start with a band called The Birthday Party. Now, The Birthday Party, the frontman of the group was named Nick Cave, who is the same Nick Cave who became famous in musical circles later in the decade and certainly into the present. But listen to the vehemence. Now, here's the thing. This music is also not that far away from hardcore punk. The difference is, both of them you could call post-punk genres. The difference is that what Nick Cave is doing, and many people consider this his goth phase, although goth at this point was not a codified genre so much, and it wasn't a codified look as well. Nevertheless, he's singing this song about this alcoholic guy named Gun, G-U-N, and the name of the song is The Fears of Gun. And then he sings these lyrics. Now, I've purposely let this point play where you've got the guitar player and the bassist and the drummer doing this repetitious pattern, particularly the guitar player is going. Now, if you were to just simply try to play along with him, you would realize how hard what he is doing is, because you keep saying to yourself, well, are you going to develop this? Well, are you going to stop? Well, are you going to give yourself a break? And the answer is no, not till this thing explodes. It's like a ticking bomb. Meanwhile, Nick Cave is singing the following lyrics, talking about, we heard some of the hardcore punk saying like, yeah, we didn't write songs about love and skipping down the lane. Well, this is the same thing. Nick Cave is singing Fingers Down the Throat of Love. And then he gets to a point where it's like someone's got a grappling hook down his throat and he goes, love, love, and he's just screaming it. And, I don't know how you look at this now, but this is a real recognition of the loss of meaning. The existential dilemma. I mean, people these days talk about the meaning crisis like it happened yesterday. I'm sorry. You have to go back here. People like Nick Cave were much closer to the actual existentialist philosophers and the nihilists than many people are today who get these ideas in a more commercialized, postmodern, ironic form. But here you feel the loss of meaning. Give it a listen.
Yeah. Gun wears his alcoholism well. Finger in bottle and swinging it still. To sink and back again. The clock is crawling around the same. His busted clock, he hates its face. Just sitting and talking to heart it takes. This talking back to clock and slow and study kicks.
For many people, goth starts officially in 1979 with the group Bauhaus, which is, I think, an important name to remember for those of you who know what that refers to. doing a song called Bela Lugosi's Dead, also an important name to remember. And in a sense, what's happening is these two things are coming together. The deadness and blankness of modern architecture with this Germanic kind of 1920s dark horror, expressionist horror aesthetic welding together, along with elements like Jim Morrison's vocals from The Doors, kind of just this, almost the empty sound of reggae, but inverted so that it's the treble rather than the bass that is emphasized. But listen to this, and this sounds very spooky, and in a sense, Goth starts here. There are precursors, it certainly develops after this, but this is the real thing. While in other places, like San Francisco, things were developing in a stranger way. Now, one of the big differences between the European punks and the American punks and all their relatives and post-punk variations is that European punks tend to be more serious, tend to be more political, at least then, tend to be more philosophical. American punks tend to be more like the kind of people who are just, pop culture addicts. They hate what they're doing. They hate the fact they watch television all the time. They make ironic, jokey comments. Consider the difference between the Sex Pistols and the Ramones. The Sex Pistols are anger incorporated. They're rage, Johnny Rotten. There is a bit of humor there, but it's about this thing erupting. Whereas the Ramones aren't about the anger. They're about the fact that life is stupid. And so, I just want to sniff some glue, gabba gabba hey. It's ironic in a really stupid way. And that also categorizes the way European experimental music differs from American experimental music. So this is from the late 70s. This is a group called The Residents, totally ironically named because someone sent their demo tape back to them, just simply marked to the Residents at so-and-so. So they said, that's the name of the group, The Residents. They never showed their face. They always played with either big eyeballs on their head or, as you'll see in this video, try to find the members of the group here. And then there's another group from the same era, late 70s. This is also from 1979 in San Francisco, and they're called Tuxedo Moon. Again, very ironic name, very San Franciscan in the late 70s sense of the word. And we're listening to a song right now in the background called Midnight Stroll. And it has this, they put out one album during the time called Mutant Pop, and that's what this sounds like. It's like pop that has mutated and is corroding around the edges. And at a certain point, this kind of like doo-wop, almost like Andrew's Sisters kind of vocal comes in the back. But rather than sounding anything like a group of people, making a nice, pleasant riff for your R&B song or pop song, it just sounds like as if it sounds like a dirge. It's like whoa, whoa, and so it's these things are mutating. There's another group from the time called Chrome. I would love to play you some of these groups. They did a whole album where 4 different groups did, for instance, versions of the song "I Left My Heart in San Francisco." None of them sounds particularly pleasant. But again, it's this experimental edge. And as you saw in the Residents video, there's something going on there that's never happened before. And that's what I find really fascinating about this period. And particularly the San Francisco music had this strange edge. edgy. Some of it borders into what we'll call industrial. Some of it is just strange. Meanwhile, in England and Germany and some other places, there was another new form of post-punk music developing. A post-punk music more influenced by the musical trends from the classical world, particularly the next group. From Germany, it's called Einstürzende Neubauten. I hope my German viewers will understand what I just said, which translates into the phrase collapsing new buildings. And that is what this music sounds like. They would, before a performance, for instance, if they came to America, they wouldn't bring that many instruments with them. What they would do is go to the junkyards and find things to pound on. And they just started pounding things on stage. And there was another group, maybe it was Test Department out of England, but who would actually construct things on stage while they were playing. Blixa Bargeld is the head singer for this group, and we'll meet him again later in a different form. But this is from a German television broadcast, and they're talking with him. And they're playing in the large room in Nuremberg that they had built specifically to hold the rallies. And they talk about, are you here to desecrate this room, or what are you doing? And he gives his philosophy on destruction. Listen to it. It's very important.
Trieb hier der Teufel den Beelzebub aus unter Gefahr einer neuerlichen Mystifizierung?
Mystifizierung, dafür hätte man irgendetwas dem Raum hinzufügen müssen, was ihm seiner eigentlichen ursprünglichen Zweckbestimmung entsprochen hätte. Aber das war, glaube ich, überhaupt nicht der Fall. Und ob es sich um eine Entweihung oder eine Exorzierung von irgendwelchen Hitlergeistern handelt, das ist eine Frage des Blickwinkels und der Seite, glaube ich. Weil die Entweihung findet für diejenigen statt, die ja den Raum in ihrem ursprünglichen Zweck sehen, und die Exorzierung für diejenigen, die eher auf meiner Seite stehen. Der Charakter von dem, was sie machen, ist auf jeden Fall nicht dazu geeignet, irgendeiner Überperson, irgendeinen Führer oder irgendeinen Faschistenkult irgendwie zu würdigen.
Musik und Antimusik werden bei den Neubauten synonym. Das Vernichten von Musik ist gleichsam Arbeit an der Musik, bis nichts mehr voneinander getrennt werden kann. Es täuscht sich, wer denkt, das Klanginferno läutet die Apokalypse ein.
Meine Vorstellung von Destruktivität ist eben, trifft sich die mit der Walter Benjamin. Er hat mal ein Essay geschrieben, das hieß der destruktive Charakter. Der destruktive Charakter ist heiter und freundlich, er kennt nur eine Devise: Platz schaffen. Und da ist eben keinerlei unbedingte moralische Wertung oder keine moralische Wertung und kein Gut und Böse und keine apokalyptischen Hintergedanken mit verbunden, kein Krieg und keine Zerstörungswut, sondern da ist eigentlich nur mehr die Notwendigkeit, wird dabei anerkannt, dass für alles Neue, was entstehen kann, erstmal die Vorbedingung geschaffen werden muss, dass das Alte beseitigt werden muss, dass dafür Raum geschaffen werden muss und dass dafür Destruktion eben notwendig ist. Garantiert zerstöre ich die Vorstellung und Erwartung von bestimmten Leuten, die sich etwas Limitiertes unter Musik vorstellen. Das war auch immer beabsichtigt, aber das trifft sich mit dem Raum schaffen und Platz machen genauso.
Blick sah Bargeld als Bote einer neuen Musikphilosophie, die in keine Schublade passt. Auch textbezogen, eine lautstarke, traumnahe Poesie.
So essentially, destruction for these groups, particularly, well, he's very philosophical, but I think you can apply this to a lot of what's going on underground in the 1980s, is sweeping away the old. Now, on one hand, that sounds like if you're thinking about, what's going on MTV and, corporate America, the preppies, the kind of return to a conservative government under Reagan, they kind of mean that. But more importantly, they mean everything. That is to say, all of the old European stuff just has to go. Now, this has a particular resonance in Germany, and you can see why. They were poisoned by what happened when people claimed to be building a new world on behalf of old Western culture. But in fact, that was all a weird nightmare based on old Western culture, but it wasn't the real thing itself. And I think you can see this. There was a group called the Virgin Prunes in England, who was kind of a goth band with sort of industrial leanings. And they came out with a 10-inch album, 2 10-inch records and an album called Heresy. Now, actually, the band was out of Ireland, not England. And in it, there is, the music is not all that important. But what is important is the literature inside this little box set. And it has their philosophy. And in their philosophy, they talk about things like, the world has become too sterile and too clean. I agree. But then they say their answer is to create filth. And they mean bodily filth. They mean, at one point, they suggest, for instance, women should take their used tampon and put them in jars and leave them around the house. Things like this. Quite strange. Sweeping away the old. All those old ideas of what was etiquette and what was aesthetically pleasing. All must go. And no one took this farther than an American performer named Diamanda Galas, who arrived on the scene. I bought her first record, which included, was only 2 songs on a big 12-inch record, and one of the songs was called Wild Women with Steak Knives, and the other one was called The Litanies of Satan, based on the poem by Charles Baudelaire, who was a very important symbolist poet in France in the second half of the 19th century. And this should give you a clue as to where a lot of this is coming from. If there's a horror vibe, it's coming out of the symbolist era. And someday I plan on doing a breakdown on why the symbolist era is much more important to us than we realize. But anyway, She was operatically trained, but more importantly had, what can I say, really shady life. It was like, it just absolutely, reading interviews with her is a frightening experience. In fact, she is the only person in New York City whom I would see on any sort of regular basis that we went to the same little store that got our mail for us in Soho. And this was for several years. And I just continued always getting my mail there. There was an old Italian guy named Lenny who ran the place. And I liked just getting my mail there rather than getting it at the post office or having it delivered to my house. And she would come in there because she got her mail there as well. But she was the only person I just couldn't bring myself to talk to. I can usually approach pretty much anyone, but you'll see why in just a moment. This is Diamanda Galas in about 1981. Someone who inspires and kind of awe-inspired terror. Okay, if you survive that, it's probably not going to get any weirder than that. But we will slide on different dimensions of weirdness as we go. So let's talk about the world of heavy metal. Now, heavy metal is a term that was used to start describing bands like, I think Led Zeppelin got the title, although they did about half their set was almost acoustic. Who was the other one? Black Sabbath. Usually, a lot of people point to them as heavy metal. You know, this loud, heavy, sludging, droning music with people kind of wailing over it. Basically, a blues-based riff that becomes super heavy and distorted. Well, and with lots of guitar solos. Well, as one could imagine, standard heavy metal after hearing punk and hardcore and stuff didn't sound so like such a big deal anymore. And so metalers did not take this lying down. One of the first groups to start to really change the way metal sounded was Motorhead. And listen to this. We would now look back at this and call this speed metal. What they did was they said, we've got to catch up. And catch up they did, indeed. They sped up the sound of heavy metal.
So good I can't believe it. Screaming to the crowd.
Now, after speed metal comes thrash. Thrash and speed metal are basically cousins to each other, but thrash is much more violent and is faster. And whereas speed metal was reacting to punk rock, thrash is reacting to hardcore. And so suddenly everything gets ramped up, the speed, and also the skill of the players, because they have to kind of catch up with this sound. This is an early performance of song Damage Incorporated by Metallica from their great album Master of Puppets, which I remember this was a huge hit, and you could never hear this on the radio because this stuff was, it was selling lots of copies, but nobody would play it because this stuff was, again, it's all the underground. Later, Metallica starts doing power ballads, and, they played with the symphony orchestra at one point. In other words, they went down the route of success. But during this point, they were doing these concerts, but it was just, and look at the recording here, it's just like terrible, terrible video because, well, people were all using their camcorders back then, and the quality is terrible. So, but anyway, watch this. But it didn't stop there. There was another species of metal that would be called death metal that was born in the 1980s. A group like Venom out of England usually gets credit for being one of the first death metal bands. And it was part of all of this, a lot of this, although Metallica is America, a lot of this comes from England, where you had what was called the British New Wave of heavy metal. Let's listen to a bit of Venom, and you'll notice something changing here. Listen to the lyrics.
Metal fight, power and sense to explode. Energy screams, magic dreams. Satan records their best notes. We time the bell, chaos in hell. Metal for maniacs pure. Fast melting steel, fortune on wheels. Brain hemorrhages to cure. Black metal, black metal, black metal.
Dark, demonic. And in fact, it gets darker. And when it gets darker, it's then called black metal. This is from Denmark, a group called King Diamond, with the lead singer also being called King Diamond. Satanic imagery and such. What's interesting is, if you compare this devil imagery with, say, the devil imagery of earlier heavy metal bands like AC/DC. In AC/DC, you're fighting the devil. In this music, you're with the devil. this is a big change. In a lot of black metal, there's a real satanic influence, and I mean that literally as far as like, it's almost Miltonian, where the devil is the hero, the Satan is the hero because he represents rebellion against the conformity of the world. A lot of the stuff is extremely anti-Christian, misanthropic. There's a lot of not only Satanism, but Nordic paganism. And this is really important because Nordic paganism is also what happened, a big influence on what happened in Germany in World War II. And in fact, in the Scandinavian circles, members of one particularly ingrown scene started burning churches and kind of killing each other. And there's still a contingent of these kind of crazed black metalists today, but they purposely keep underground. It's remained an underground scene, but very powerful, and all this black metal went on to have a tremendous amount of influence to other metal scenes that developed. And in fact, let's listen to a song by one of the first Scandinavian black metal bands called Bathory, named after the vampire Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who used to bathe in the blood of young virgins, according to the story. And one of the things to notice is it's not just the wailing, screaming that you heard with King Diamond, but it's also this tortured voice, like kind of voice, which would later turn into the almost cliche, like death metal voice. So let's listen to this, If You Dare. And one thing you may be noticing by this time is that there is already a very tribal element to what's going on. So it's not just hardcore punks, but there's also the Oi movement and skinheads. It's not just that there's heavy metal, but rather, in fact, there's older heavy metal and glam metal and all this other kinds of metal, but then there's like speed metal and thrash and black metal and death metal, and eventually there'll be, I think the number is well over 100 genres of metal by this point. So what's happened is there's this tribal element. Why is this so important? Because we're seeing the breakdown of what had been a central culture. If you go back to the 1960s, even the countercultural stuff of the 1960s, people tended to listen to, you were either listening to mainstream types of music or you were listening to the countercultural music. And so you followed it all. People have often say, well, why are, Simon and Garfunkel are written about in rock history books? Because they don't sound to our ears much like rock music these days. Well, it's because it was all part of one movement called rock. I mean, there was rock and roll, but rock was more of an umbrella term for many more different styles that all came together. Acid rock and British wave and British beat music, British invasion, and the California sound, and all these things were under the heading of rock. And punk rock put a big division in that, but after punk rock, then suddenly everything just multiplies. So we've already talked about rap and the kind of new wave music that gets on MTV, the New Romantics, that sort of thing. And that's over, a lot of that stuff's in the mainstream. But what's happening underneath, for instance, there had been this Jamaican style called ska. Well, a lot of Jamaicans ended up in England. And so then there was a ska revival in the late 1970s, early 1980s with bands like The English Beat.
Gonna take you to a restaurant that's got glass tables. You can watch yourself while you are eating. Beer in the bathroom, I just can't stop it. Every Saturday you see me window shopping. Buying now interest in the right time shelf. Just 1,000 reflections of my own sweet self.
Now, this lasted a couple of years and then seemed to vanish, but it didn't vanish. It went underground. And particularly in a place like New York or Boston, there were bands who were doing, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones in Boston, and New York City had the Toasters. Now, I'm very familiar with the Toasters. I used to work with them. That is to say, with all of them. We worked at the very large Forbidden Planet before it moved across the street to its smaller location, but on 12th Street and Broadway. And it was like 3 stories, 2 of actual store and 1 of warehouse. And Rob Hingley, the lead singer, was the manager of the store. And my friend Greg Grinnell was the trombone and other horn player in the band, and you'll see him playing. But let's, in fact, watch the Toasters. Now, I remember during those days, the Toasters, they were almost like a joke to me. It's like, you guys are still doing ska? Ska revival? This was like mid-1980s, 86, 87. Little did I know that this was going to go underground and come up again in the late 90s. Just very strange. And so now they're considered to be like this really important band, and I just find that really funny. Another scene from the times was the skate scene. Skateboarding was becoming something. This wasn't so much connected to skate punks yet, but it was starting to. But it was a whole separate tribal scene. If you were a skateboarder, you lived in a different world. I remember this one skateboarder. I never knew his name, but he was in New York City, and he had set up on St. Mark's Place and put these like barrels turned upwise, not laying over, but upwise, and he would like take off down the street and then jump over the 3 or 4 of them at once, and it was just like, whoa, these guys were in their own world. Let's watch a little on skateboarding here.
The lure, of course, is to defy gravity, hopefully with style, just like the skateboard pros do. 19-year-old Tony Hawk is king of the cult, inventor of such maneuvers as the 720, that's 2 mid-air somersaults, the Madonna, and the Frigidaire. Between appearances and sales of his own boards, he earns in excess of $150,000 a year. Skateboards have been very, very good to Tony.
Yeah, for me it has been. I bought a house, a condominium in Carlsbad.
The sport has developed its own language, which to the uninitiated sounds like dialogue from an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie.
I just like, stoking other people out, if you know what stoking means.
Just go down to Venice.
Something happened in slide and roll curves, or... Sorry, bro, they're all secrets.
I'll buy you Chevrolet. I'll buy you Chevrolet. I'll buy you a Chevrolet. You just give me some of your love now. You just give me some of your love now, girl. I don't want your Chevrolet. Don't want your Chevrolet. I don't want your Chevrolet. Just give me some of your love now. Just give me some of your love now. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. You just give me some of your love now. Just give me some of your love now.
Yeah, Tony Hawk went on to become like a legend, but he was already really well known and getting financial backing then. But again, there were these weird sense of tribes. Interestingly enough, in that last example, we heard behind it garage rock from the 1960s. I played that on purpose. One, it mentions don't want a Chevrolet, things like that. What do I want? I want my skateboard. But also because garage rock was an underground world. Garage rock essentially was the louder, more aggressive rock music that influenced punk rock in the 1960s, but it was washed away by the Sgt. Pepper's album, Beatles psychedelic phase, the San Francisco groups, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, all of this stuff washed away the garage rock sound, and then it was revived by people like the Ramones and then the punks, but they treated it differently, as they used it as cannon fodder for a new style. Whereas the garage rock revivalists were much more interested in redoing garage rock, that is to say, keeping the tradition alive. Here's an important band from the Massachusetts area called The Liars. Jeff Connolly on vocals. I don't know. I'd rather listen to that any day over 99% of what appears on videos these days, because it's got grit, it's got an edge. A lot of this stuff from the 1980s, the underground, what sets it apart from the overground, and the overground is what's going to become our commercial culture today, but the stuff in the underground, what it has that so much music today does not have is an edge. And by that I mean something's at stake. It's not just people singing. It's like something matters here. And you don't have to sing loud music to have an edge. You can sing quiet music and have an edge. But there's a lot of edge missing in today's world because, well, for one thing, when people are sitting around looking at this thing and that's the source of their culture, you can't even have a personality. You're just a photo on an Instagram page. And another thing that started happening was that the garage rock revivalists and punks wanted to see the legendary garage rockers from the 1960s, most of whom who had, again, been flushed away by all of the changes of the 60s. They were the mid-60s, but the mid-60s were like ancient history by 1969. And who could remember Rocky Erickson and the 13th Floor Elevators in 1969? Well, no one. And Rocky himself hardly remembered himself then because he'd gotten too pickled in the acid. But he was brought out of retirement. He always was doing things. Rocky had a troubled life, but he was always doing things. But this is from the 1980s. He was brought out of retirement to do 13th Floor Elevator material. And nobody's got anything on him. Nobody's got more edge. No one's got more grit. No one screams better than Rocky Erickson. Absolutely amazing garage rock from a 60s icon who passed away sadly a few years ago. Another great 60s icon was Arthur Lee, but I can't go on and on and on talking about these things. But what that does show you is that the 60s were starting to make a comeback. Now, the punks had brought the garage rock, but soon the hippie music would start coming back as well as a new emphasis on hippies. But I would emphasize, in my thinking, well, we're about to see people called hippies in England. And there was a whole movement of travelers, of what would later be called crusties, crust punks. But basically what they are is neo-hippies. And the difference is that neo-hippies are missing an element of the original hippies. The original hippies were more connected to the folk protest movement. Then they took acid and everything got weird. Well, I've talked about the hippies before and the whole dream. But the thing was, most of the early hippies were well read. Most of them were not just drifting around. I mean, they did after they started getting pickled in the punch, but they had, I mean, you could talk to them, you know, they might have read Dostoevsky or Nietzsche or Sartre. You know, they might have read the political works of this figure or that. They might have read The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. That's the 60s. Those people disappeared by around 1970 or were, you know, it's like they got siphoned off into communes and such like that. But these new tribes, these new people called hippies, and I really never call them that because to me they're not. I mean, people think if you take psychedelics and you're listen to kind of old school music like the Deadheads. Deadheads are another thing that's the Deadhead revival starts about 1989. In many ways, it's more of a 90s phenomenon, but I'll deal with it here. Oh, okay. I've received a package. So anyway, let's watch, Deadheads. So, the Deadheads were basically reviving the vibes, I would call it, of the Grateful Dead in San Francisco in the 60s. And that's all they were reviving. They were not reviving anything like the 60s. And in fact, check out the colors of this guy's shirt. Nobody ever wore a tie-dye shirt that had that silly blue color in it. Why? Because this is professionally made. Someone takes a certain color shirt, then tie-dyes it. The stuff in the 60s was never professionally made. It was always homemade. It was always with whatever material you had. And lots of the stuff, you had like bleached out jeans. I did that a few times. In fact, I did some house painting as a kid and just left the paint on because it was cool. But let's watch a little bit of what was happening in England, because this becomes very important. There were these traveling groups who would then go to concerts. There's the Trewargy concert, where, again, it's these people going to kind of have a rock festival a la 60s experience. Same with Stonehenge. Stonehenge becomes very important to these people because they're connecting. See, what's happening is there's this other thing, the neo-pagan stuff, which was just kind of coming up in the 60s, but actually Eastern religion was much more prevalent in the 60s. But this neo-pagan stuff, it's everyone's saying like, we have to get to Stonehenge, we have to get to Stonehenge. Not realizing that, hey, Stonehenge is being ruined by all the tourism, especially this kind of tourism. So let's watch these news channels talking about the new hippies.
Dozens of hippies have appeared in court after violent clashes with police early today at Stonehenge. Altogether, there were more than 60 arrests and 10 people were injured, including 8 policemen. The trouble started when about 200 hippies tried to reach the part of Stonehenge where the summer solstice was being celebrated. Tonight, the local Conservative MP, Robert Key, said it was time to blow the whistle on this senseless annual punch-up.
The hippies say they believe in peaceful coexistence. The peacemakers among them, though, were simply brushed aside. For a few, this seemed to be what they'd come for. They can't even have hoped to win. Some got through to taunt the police, some tried and didn't make it. Most of them didn't even try.
Interestingly enough, this neo-hippie thing kind of relates to another, what seems very vastly different phenomena, and yet is very similar, and that is the birth of the raves. There was, I believe it was 1987 in Manchester, or what they called Madchester. The second summer of love, they called it. But what was it all? It was like DJs playing electronic music. Here's we'll do a little bit of a survey of this scene, and so we're going to go into now. What would happen was they would have these raves. In the beginning, raves were always illegal parties. You would take over, a particularly good place to take over would be an industrial building. And then you would somehow connect to a power source, maybe illegally. Then you would send out invitations, and then people would come and be all very surreptitious. And then people would be on MDMA or, ecstasy. They would be, taking stuff. Acid itself didn't make so much of a comeback yet, although some of it did. And we'll talk about how acid did come back through the back door in a bit. But essentially, it was this place where people would just ritualize this behavior. Although watching these people, I'm sitting there saying to myself, they think they're having a much better experience than I can see that they have. That is to say, they just seem to be, who knows how to dance anymore? That's the big problem. Now, what had happened was there was a disco scene. And you remember the late 70s disco. Well, that became kind of a joke, but it never really went away. What happened was in the post-disco world, the elements kept getting stripped down until finally, along with some of the techniques that the rappers had developed in their turntablism, they were starting to just play repetitious motifs over and over, or even finding blank. I have many flip sides to early 80s dance records that are just rhythms and such. And so they would find these things. with the advent of more digital equipment and stuff, you started getting more of just this repetition. You can hear it in Little Lewis's piece that we're about to play called French Kiss, which also adds a woman's rather obvious moaning as part of it. It's a very long piece, but I've played a little bit of the end of it here. And then we'll go into watching what's going on in England. So, I was going to say, so what had happened was that in places like Detroit, this new music was born out of post-disco, and it was called house music. And it was primarily this really repetitious dance music, and it eventually turns into this electronic music. And the kind of electronic music that still exists, that people go dance to. And to me, the issue with electronic music is you're now at the point where the melody has almost no point. And if you're in a room with huge speakers thumping, you can't help but move with it. And so it becomes a kind of an empty ritual experience for people who want meaning, but really have no idea where to look for it. We'll see more about raves when we get to the 1990s. So let's go back to the hardcore scene. By Reagan's second inauguration, the flies were in the ointment. Let them explain.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
Will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Reagan won the first time. It was almost like unbelievable. Something could be, how could this be? Then the second time he won, it was very disillusioning for myself. Those first 4 years of punk rock for me, 80 to 84, was all this hope. And then after that, got cynical. And punk rock fragmented into many, many, many different scenes.
A lot of the people who had started this local music scene in 1979 and 80 had become a little bit disillusioned. The baby was no longer cute.
85, 86 was a total decline of the punk rock scene.
And then everybody who started the scenes all left it, one by one by one by one.
I came in August of 81, and I'd say by the end of 85, it was over. These people were not like sheep. They were not like heavy metal sheep that would go see their band, their spandex pants band, over and over again. They could turn on you. And chances are, in a 3-year period that you're into it, they're going to get disinterested. Or your time was up, whichever's first. So basically, the time was up.
You might think like, well, yeah, but you really checked out on hardcore. I never fucking checked out. Hardcore checked out, not me. Like for me, the violence was stupid. It just became stupid, and I saw my own role in the stupidity. In 1984, I remember it was the Minutemen show. It was the last time I punched somebody. The guy hit my brother, and I punched him, and I thought, that's the end of that. I'm done. And I felt like the violence had become too central. And it was clearly alienating to most people. It was ridiculous. So I thought, like, I'm out. I'm out of this. And a lot of my friends were out of it, too. They were like, this sucks. It was a bummer.
I think that was kind of the end of that era of hardcore.
The last ever Black Flag show that I acknowledge happened in 1986 in Detroit at Greystone. It's a hall. Weeks later, I'm in DC visiting friends and family, and Greg called me at my mom's house where I was kind of camping out, and he said, I'm just calling to tell you that I quit Black Flag. I go, but it's your band. And he goes, well, I quit. I went, okay. And that was it.
I decided in 1986, it's like, no, it's a good time to stop now. Black Flag was left without the culture around it. It was back to where we started.
I will actually be the first punk or whatever person in the scene say punk is dead.
It was over a long time ago. It's over, okay? Go home. Your cage is clean.
Now, hardcore never quite disappeared as much as it became more, what shall I say, ritualistic, so that only a certain kind of people would be involved with it. I'm sure if one looks for the certain kinds of punk performances today, one can still find them. But in the late 70s again, 79, a very crucial year, because so much seemed to be ending and starting that year. There was a scene called No Wave in New York City with bands like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, who Teenage Jesus was a girl named Lydia Lunch. Let's listen to her sing. saying is probably the wrong word now, isn't it? And that's not an accident. This was music. This is very egalitarian music for people who don't even play instruments. It's just essentially rhythms made by people who have no musical background whatsoever, playing, and but there's a sense of real despair and noise. The noise is very important. Now, there were several other bands in the late 70s, early 80s, the Contortions and DNA and I think another one's Mars. And then there was a group called the Swans. Now, the Swans was a dark, sludgy affair. This was not heavy metal. This was not punk rock. This was something else. The only word we could have for this today is this is noise. But listen to the dark, despairing intensity of it. And then there's the Butthole Surfers. Even the name tells you we're somewhere else. Yeah. And eventually, in the late 90s, they actually had a hit called Pepper. And people had to say their name on the radio. But obviously, with a name like that, their basic thought was not success. But it was outrage. It was humor. Dark, ironic, postmodern humor. The Butthole Surfers, well, let's watch a moment of them first.
Ain't no kind of sexual feeling that I would not, should not, I could not do. See this right here. Now you going down to Florida way. You know that I'm going to have to potty train the chairman Mao. Gonna make the governor write my doo-doo letter child. I'm gonna brand me up a White Castle slider out of India's sacred cow. But I'm moving down to Florida. I'm gonna build me the atomic bomb. Well, I'm gonna hold the time.
How was that? What was that? In the about 1982, 83, 84, everyone I knew in New York was listening to the Butthole Surfers. You'd see someone with a Walkman with their cassette listening to something, and you say, what are you listening to? And they go, Butthole Surfers. They were tremendously important because they were coming from Texas, but they had encapsulated the new mood, the mood which still gets us today, of complete ironic detachment. We could call this cool, but they were beyond cool. They were just insane. And Gibby Haynes, the main vocalist that we saw there, dressed in a dress, not to make a transgender point, but just simply to be, you know, like you see this sometimes in freak shows where they just put a dress on someone because it was simpler. Just an outrageous sort of presentation. In fact, I'm told that, and I couldn't find an example of this. Again, the actual video surviving material on this stuff is very poor. But they used to have a projector on the wall for some of their bigger shows. And they show stuff like penis reconstruction surgeries, farming accidents involving combine harvesters, They would show these in the background. They also encouraged everyone. Evidently in Texas, the whole LSD thing came later than it did in other places and survived longer. See Bill Hicks, the comedian. But they would encourage people to take mushrooms or acid and then go on a trip. And here is where it's kind of like they knew, they're showing you this imagery, they're doing these shows, they know it's going to be a bad trip, and they don't care. That is a radical change and departure. This has nothing to do with the 60s anymore. But what it is doing is taking an aspect of punk rock and an aspect of the hippies and welding them together in, shall we say, an unholy way. This is going to be the future, at least through the 90s. This weird mixture of elements. More Butthole Surfers, please. Now again, going back to the Swans, who were an early noise band coming out of the no-wave scene, and what they were doing was almost ritualistic noise. You could tell that Michael Gira was just chanting and doing these strange things. Other bands at the time, two in particular, I have a closer relationship to. One is called Band of Susans. The reason they called it Band of Susans is because there were 3 different Susans in the band when they started, but Robert Poss was actually, and Susan Stenger were actually the main people behind the band. But here's the thing about their music. They were totally influenced by the Avant-garde. That is to say, they were not just rock and rollers who wandered into play. They may have seen something like No Wave, but then they thought to themselves something like Lamont Young. You know, they thought something like Glenn Branca, of whom they played with, as did Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth. So that you got these people who were coming out of this, legitimate avant-garde with real musical training, but now they were using it to create this noise. Here's a little bit of Band of Susans. They were the only band I could literally depend on destroying my ears when I would go. I mean, I think once I accidentally did not stuff I would usually take some paper toweling and wad it up and put it in my ears. Once I forgot, my ears rang for days. I discovered something, going to too many bands, is that the bass notes do less damage to your ear than treble. And this band was all about 3 droning treble guitars. And it would just be like, oh. Band of Susans. And kind of their cousins, in a sense, were Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth became much more popular and well-known, but I would put them equal to each other in many respects. So Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore and Lee Ronaldo were some of the people behind Sonic Youth, and they would do these long, drony things. Again, I used to find, Robert Poss and Susan Stenger were good friends of mine back in New York. And Thurston Moore used to come into the small record store that I worked in the early 90s. I was buying and selling record collections, and he was specifically looking for avant-garde records. So, again, these are not musical naifs doing this. These are people who are philosophically, pushing the boundaries. And let's listen to a little bit of some of the more chaotic sounds and intense sounds of Sonic Youth from the late 80s. And we're going to leave that there because it's through Sonic Youth, who we will hear again in our 90s episode, that we start to enter the world of the 90s. Another sign was there was a thing that started to be called alternative music, alternative rock. There'd be groups like REM or They Might Be Giants. And another band that was very important was Camper Van Beethoven. Now, just the name itself. Well, a camper van is a type of recreational vehicle. Beethoven is a composer. Camper Van Beethoven. Consider the difference between the names like 13th Floor Elevator, Jefferson Airplane, Moby Grape. Well, they kind of have a sense of humor to them, but there's also this cosmic kind of strangeness to them. Whereas Camper Van Beethoven is purely postmodern irony. It's like, oh, Camper Van Beethoven. Ha ha ha. You know, it is this ironic, and the band itself is like this. They played a variety of styles. You couldn't pin them down. But their most famous song, Take the Skinheads Bowling, which is very interesting because they were obviously talking about the neo-Nazis, but they were basically saying, you know, this would be a good way to deal with these guys. Just take them bowling instead of being afraid of them. And it's hard to imagine anyone on the left today saying this about anyone they can, and their expanded definition of what's fascist. It's hard to see them taking a centrist bowling, let alone a skinhead. Play it.
Everybody's coming home for lunch these days. Last night there were skinheads on my lawn. Take the skinheads bowling, take
And of course, with all this crazy music, it was only natural that at some point someone would say, what's going on here? And the PMRC, led by Tipper Gore, what was it, Parents Music Resource Center or something like that, decided they needed to put labels on the records. And so they devised what we call the parental advisory label. And this ended up going on records. Of course, in places like Walmart, you can't even sell the parental label version of an album. So they would make the edited version that had things cut out of it. Same album, same music. And everyone knew what was missing. But what kids would do in the 90s is they would look for the ones that had the labels on them. So that the parental advisory label became the thing that kids looked for, of course. And that helped to create a lot of the culture of the 90s. But let's continue. Now, to me, one of the most interesting and fascinating, probably healthiest of the tribes of the 1980s was what I'd call folk punk, which has a slight prehistory, goes back to the folky movement, and there were people who were adding electric guitars and things to folk rock, like Fairport Convention or Steel Eye Span, or even in France, like groups like Malicorne or Trion. But these bands always kind of played the music very, what should I say? They played it very faithfully in many ways, almost reverently, almost too reverently. Whereas the folk punks just took, and you can see this with the Pogues, they're doing traditional Irish music, but just juiced up on punk rock energy and not being particularly precious with the material. I consider this a step forward over the older folk revival stuff. As much as I like the older folk revival stuff, it is in itself a bit of a dead end. Whereas the folk punk stuff continues to this day in different forms because it's got so much energy and life to it. It's a way of continuing the past without necessarily denigrating the past. And this movement, well, we'll see it in the 90s we'll see it more in the second half of the 90s. But let's listen to the Pogues. And Shane MacGowan, the lead singer here, troubled soul, but what a character. And their whole presentation was quite interesting. The Pogues.
When I'm touching out, I'm burning the sad city. Loving your hand and I'm wondering
Another character that I don't know where else to put him, but I'm going to put him here. There was a musician who was a singer-songwriter back in the 1970s, but had more of a predilection for singing like jazzy songs as if he was a beat poet. And then suddenly, one day in the early 80s, he just chucked it all. Not entirely. He still did his old material sometimes, but suddenly changed his style radically and came out with an album called Swordfish Trombones, and that was Tom Waits. And when he performed live, there was this real sense of primitivism about what he was doing. And in fact, later, I would consider him one of the progenitors of American Gothic music, which to me is a bookend to folk punk, which is why I'm putting it here. Let's listen to a little bit of Tom Waits. Now, of all the people we're not expecting to run into in this section, is the person we're going to run into in this section. And that's Nick Cave from the Birthday Party. Last we saw, he had his fingers down the throat of love, and it sounded like a lot more than love was being vomited out of him. But in a sense, one of the things I liked, he also wrote songs like Big Jesus Trash Can, or another song, Sonny's Burning, where he goes, hands up, who wants to die? That's the, these are dark, despairing songs, or as he puts it, his Old Testament phase. But he said at a certain point he had to shift gears, and we'll talk about that shift in a minute. But I started noticing something in his album called The Firstborn is Dead. And what I noticed is that he was essentially starting to explore. He would do songs that were based on the blues, based on work songs, chain gang music, based on sea shanties, which I thought was fascinating. Because my feeling, and I remember saying this to a friend at the time, my feeling is you can't start by investigating these older styles without starting to be influenced by them, which to me was a very healthy sign. I had heard from a good friend of mine who met Nick Cave and said, yeah, the guy's a total junkie. He was shooting heroin. He needed something. And I was glad that he started to discover this, because I felt for me this was a way out of his dilemma. Let's listen to a bit of a live version of his song. You'll notice he's also changed the way he's dressed. That is to say, he starts to wear black suits, white shirts, and he's continued in this mode ever since. He had some sort of big change around this time where he started to look at things differently. But let's listen to a song called Blind Lemon Jefferson. Blind Lemon Jefferson, for those who don't know, was a blind blues singer who used to wander around the train tracks in Mississippi, and he would sing for nickels and quarters to the guys working on the railroads and such. And he put out a few albums, or at least albums worth of material. It was more like different singles on 78s. But Nick Cave discovered this and wrote a song about him. But listen to the mournful quality. You can't really appreciate this. I would suggest going and finding the album Firstborn is Dead. It is one of my all-time favorite Nick Cave albums. Take it away. But as I said, Nick Cave had said he was in an Old Testament mood, and at a certain point he said, I need to close that book and open up another book. And the book he said he was going to open up was the New Testament. This didn't mean that he was never going to do darker material again. But listen to this song that shows up on his Tender Prey album. It's called New Morning. Interestingly enough, who's in his Bad Seeds band? But Blixa Bargeld from Einstürzende Neubauten, which I find really fascinating as well. So, you have these characters who philosophically were so dark, looking for something more meaningful. And to me, these are part of the people who are pointing a way that other people, unfortunately very few, but other people needed to follow. And I once did meet Nick Cave. Unfortunately, a good friend of mine who seems to know everybody, Larry Ratso Sloman in New York City. I mean, friend of Bob Dylan. He knew Allen Ginsberg, knew Leonard Cohen, and he knew Nick Cave, knows Nick Cave. And he took me over where he's having a book signing. And I just shook Nick Cave's hand and said hello. Because I wanted to really talk to him. I wanted to talk to him about God, because some of his songs were about God. I wanted to talk to him about what he was thinking about life. But unfortunately, he had like 400 people outside of this huge tower record store waiting to sign his autograph. This was in the mid-90s. And I just said, I can't do this to him. He's just got too much, too much on his mind, all these people and such. It's just, this is not the time. So I never had a chance to talk with him. But I did meet him. That was a nice thing. Nick Cave, tell us about The New Morning. And tell me, doesn't this sound like gospel music? We're going to end with a song, a very superficial song by a very superficial singer, big hair and all, wearing bad 80s fashion, Laura Branigan. This was a song originally written and sung by an Italian singer who just went by the name of Raph, short no doubt for Raphael. And the song is called Self-Control. And let me play you a little bit of it. What I've done is I've found the lyrics of the song and I've superimposed it on the video. And I want you to pay attention to the lyrics. Okay, so far pretty obvious. This person wants to live in the nightlife, the clubs, the dancing, the whatever goes on at night. Let's continue with the song. In the night, no control. Through the wall, something's breaking. Wearing white as you're walking down the street of my soul. Not particularly deep, little slight bit of poetry, but that's not what I'm trying to get to here. Although the wearing white is interesting because it's almost this ghostly image of a person, although she doesn't do that in this film. You take my self-control. You got me living only for the night, which I think is really fascinating. The creation of these almost vampiric people. And I knew a lot of these people in New York City. Their whole world was for nightclubs. There was a really trashy 1980s film. If you want to see real superficial, trashy 1980s culture, go watch the movie Modern Girls, which I think is kind of fascinating for being such an example of the trashy, superficial nature of the 1980s. But in The Morning Comes, the story's told, you take my self-control. And what is this self-control? It's almost like it's an undoing of that search for the self, although that isn't going away. But what's taking it away? It's the night that's taking it away. It's the darkness. And in fact, the 80s is entirely a dark period. And even all of those, how many of those genre films are horror films? And how many of those science fiction films have darker themes if you just scratch a little bit below the surface? Another day goes by. I never stop myself to wonder why. You help me to forget to play my role. You take my self-control. But here's the interesting thing. Another day goes by. And what's happening? Another day goes by. And what's happening in the day? You're sleeping. And what's happening at night? You're living this weird, zombie-like, vampiric essence. But now we come to the central point. I live among the creatures of the night. I haven't got the will to try to fight against a new tomorrow. So I guess I'll just believe it that tomorrow never comes. And to me, the line that really gets to me is this. I haven't got the will to fight against the new tomorrow. So I guess I'll just believe it that tomorrow never comes. The new tomorrow. What was that new tomorrow? We're living in it. So in other words, what the 80s is a refusal. A refusal to live in the world. It is a surrender to fun, to cute things, to technology, to trashy music, trashy culture. And then there's that character that seems to be like Death, wearing the white mask in this. A very eerie video as well as the song. Because on one hand, if you just listen to it, it's kind of like this dance song, you lose my self-control. And you just can imagine a person losing their self-control, dancing, having fun, drinking, taking drugs, going back with someone, having sex, and lose your self-control. But why are they doing it? Because they haven't got the courage to fight against the new tomorrow. They haven't got the courage to try to understand what in the hell is going on. And that sense of what Solzhenitsyn called the failure of courage is what this is all about. So that superficiality masks a darkness. Do you want to see the darkness? Come back next week, because we're going to descend from the superficial gloss, that thing that everyone remembers and has, oh yeah, the 80s, the poofy shoulder pads and the big hair, and the George Michael and Freddie Mercury. Yeah, the 80s. And we're going to go down below the surface and see what was in the underground. There are a few decades that are this stark. The 50s was like this. But this is even much more so, because the gloss of the 80s is completely illusory, even to the people living it. Whereas in the 50s, there were really people who believed that American dream. They believed they could be, the Cleavers, with Leave It to Beaver. They believed they could be part of My Three Sons. They believed that if we just played enough easy listening music, we could actually relax and maybe eventually get back to some kind of normality, whatever that was. But in the 80s, no one actually believes it. All that talk about money, no one actually believes it because everyone's still hustling for money and no one can get enough except for a few rich Wall Street types. But underneath this surface was something, a bubbling cauldron of styles and images that are going to come bubbling up to the surface almost on cue as the 1990s begins.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Lare,